worker cooperatives, basically we've talked about the surplus, which I like that word better than profits. They go to the workers that obviously, produce it. Hello.
Right.
So, and then of course, as we've said over and over, and we will repeat it over and over, the workers make the decisions democratically. Hello. So we've gone over the business advantages of worker cooperatives, I think, or I should say, let's talk about more of the benefits to the community and the environment. Like you mentioned, the taxes stay in the local tax pool for local community needs, not for, as I mentioned earlier, in the pockets of rich people who want to pass on the burden, that they don't want to pay for. There's also, that way you become a better steward of your local environment, and you're more engaged in civil and local activities. Your health care is less of an issue because you don't, and you're going to your job, you don't have to travel like we do here in LA. I know so many people that are on, all you have to do at any time of day, particularly rush hour, and you see that, people still like going the 210 freeway, the 101, the 405, and like, why don't you live close to where you work? What's going on here? It doesn't make any sense. Now it's time, are you ready? It's time to really buckle down here. And because this is a Nowman show, of course, this is a pertinent question. Why worker cooperatives now? We need to own the economy.
Yes.
That's my first answer. What do you guys think?
We need to own the economy.
Well, I would like to say that we're in a massive institutional crisis, political and economic, and it's enduring and it's getting worse. And the historical record seems to be proving that. So one of the major issues is what are the policies that are going to get us out of this? Apparently the old policies, which were based on the capitalist model, was minor reform, some regulation, but you don't change the underlying relationships of economic or political power, meaning what we're talking about here is empowering workers in the workplace democratically. If that doesn't change, then essentially the system will move on, kind of creaking along, but the workers themselves will still be in the same position. They'll be essentially disempowered.
That's right.
The point is, if you empower them, then you'll have a ramifying effect where you start changing the workplace, therefore it starts changing the outside community, therefore it starts changing the larger political institutions, state, local, state, and federal. And
we also need to educate people about, not only the history that's involved in policy making and in this country and even from a global standpoint, but also too, what's going on in current events. A lot of people have, as you referred to, a lot of political confusion about what's actually going on in current events. You know what I mean? Or understanding political strategies and how people use the system for their own personal gain in political elections or political interactions of business behavior. Like in lobbying, for instance, and we need to, we need to get the money out of politics. To me, this is not just, I'm going to say we need to get money out of politics. We need to actually get that money out of the political system, folks, because it's a problem.
The clearest message from the last election is that people are unhappy with the way politicians operate. And the biggest part of that is the fact that they owe their allegiance not to the voter, but to the people who paid for their campaign.
That's right.
The big donors that paid for their campaign. So consequently, if we want our democracy back, we need to get money out of politics. And so I worked a lot on this topic. I work for organized labor, so obviously I do. But there's a point where you watch people come up with various fixes to the economic system, bills to regulate donations and whatnot. But there is a fundamental principle, and what I watched was that people are putting the Band-Aid here and the Band-Aid there to try to put the finger in the dike or whatever, the little fix-up. But the fundamental principle is that we do not own our own economy. The fact that that so much wealth inequality exists and is fundamental to this, and is one of the greatest problems in our society now. So in order to reverse that, we have to take back ownership of our economy.
That's right.
And the only way we can do that is to create worker cooperatives.
Yeah.
That's
I
the only
agree.
principle. So that's why I have now made that decision that this is what I'm working on. This is the fundamental, and there's a lot of people doing good work, and those Band-Aids and those fixes, have to be done because we have to exist in the world as it is now. But there's somebody has to be working on, some people have to
That's
work
right.
on what is the fundamental underlying problem. And it's a long-term fight.
That's right.
So that's why, you can't just only do this, you have to do all those other things as well.
That's right.
But we have to start now.
That's right.
Because
Absolutely.
we're on a speeding train, heading for a cliff, accelerating as we go, waiting for the bridge to be built before we get there.
That's right.
So
That's
to
right.
touch on all that, we there's that Stanford study, I believe it was, that
Princeton Study.
Princeton
Study.
thank you,
Yes, 2014.
that showed us that
That's part of what I was going to talk about in this.
that
Yeah.
showed us that and people in across the political spectrum talk about how we have to change policy, as you guys have touched on. The problem is that we have actual studies that show that it doesn't matter who you put in office, it doesn't matter what principles get pushed, what talking points the politician comes with, and what people buy into. What you get at the end of the day is policy that's geared towards people who are donating money
That's right.
to the politicians
That's
themselves. The people who have their voice heard the most are the people that have the most money. And that's what that Princeton study showed us, and it's across the board always been the case.
And
so
to give a little background, which I've talked a little bit on the show a lot because there's certain things that just have to be repeated, and I
Yeah.
want to do that in this moment in time. There were over 1,700 policies that were implemented into law between 1981 and 2002. So I'm assuming that includes that Patriot Act that everybody talks about. Okay, that's my reaction. Okay. And they came to the conclusion that, and it was an open question, basically, is the United States, a democracy,
or an oligarchy.
or is it a combination of democracy and oligarchy, or is it just 100% oligarchy? And based on the analysis of over 1,700 policies, bills, etc., 100% oligarchy.
Yeah.
And what that means, basically, people, is that the most important decisions, guess how much you and I have input into that?
Zero. Absolutely none.
Okay.
Very well-meaning people become politicians, and I've known
Yeah.
a number of them,
Yeah.
and they're strong, they're committed, they're very good people. But once you get in office, all you have to plan for is how are you going to get reelected.
That's right.
And so the re-election process depends on the funding from large donors. Now, the other thing I'll say about that is corporations are no longer governed by our national government, national bodies. They're no longer responsive or accountable to nations. They are larger than nations.
Yeah.
That's
Yes,
right.
that's
That's
true.
right. You're right.
And so with all that said, you have a system where we can see with data that the policy doesn't respond to the public's will. It responds specifically to corporate will. And so at the end of the day, we know that the incentive system of profit, the incentive system of capitalism is the problem and is the thing that we need that is most important to focus on. And so people who focus on there are a lot of people who focus on policy, and personally, I feel that that's such a misguided approach. This is why worker cooperatives are so important right now. Worker cooperatives are our best opportunity to take economic control over the means of production, to take economic control over
right.
the things that are going to allow us to have that political power.
And that's absolutely correct. And I also think people need to be armed with information about how they're affected and why that is important. In other words, every year I look forward, actually, or not look forward, to looking at the updated Oxfam statistics. That come out. They usually announce them at the Davos Economic Summit in Switzerland every year in January, and every year they just get worse and worse. And this year there are 8 people on the planet that may have changed to 5, who have as much wealth as the bottom 50% of the world's population. Now, when I first heard that, I don't know how many years back now, that there were, I think it was 62 the first time I saw statistics on that. Now it's down to 8, possibly 5. I was shocked. I mean, that's, in other words, that's shocking, maybe is more the right word. Just that was my reaction. I wasn't surprised, but I found it shocking that actually somebody had that statistical analysis, and it's blatant and it's obvious. So that should get you to think about that. Plus the employment statistics, everybody knows is a joke. 94% of the jobs that were created between 2008 and 2016 were part-time, temporary, what they call gig jobs, which we musicians know what that means. And also, if there were full-time positions, most of them were low wage. So, I mean, it's and the 4% that they say is the low unemployment rate. That's pertaining to the last 3 months that they have the official data, which they always put out every 3 months. That's why they call them quarterly reports. I mean, it's just there's so much, that's just not correct. There's underemployment. There's people that they're not even reported anymore because they just gave up looking for work because what's the point? Because this is another episode. We can talk about stuff, but we're now, we had talked about corporations externalizing costs so the taxpayers pay. So that affects your income too if you are working. So because as a taxpayer, you pay on everything. So you're paying a personal income tax. Every time you go to the store, you're paying a consumer tax. Right,
they're all regressive taxes.
They're all.
Yes.
And you have so that means that also too. Not only is it less out of your pocket, but it's less going into the community. And I know a person that analyzed the tax records that were available at the time, and he's the guy that wrote the blogs in 2010. 2011 that got the attention of Adbusters magazine and Anonymous, and they together created a couple of movements you might have heard of, the 99% movement and Occupy Wall Street, and those were based on tax records.
What's called capital flows or mobile capital is now global, and this is what we were talking about a little earlier, that the new, era of capitalism or neoliberalism, globalization of finance capital now, where you have the flow of trillions of dollars kind of floating above everybody globally. And yet offshore tax havens, because now capital and capitalists and corporations are mobile, but workers are confined within the boundaries of sovereign states. This whole issue of the immigration issue, which is used as a scapegoat issue, that if you look at it from a global point of view, when capital moves, it tries to essentially imprison workers within low-wage, what they call free export zones or whatever. That was all the NAFTA and whole idea of free trade concepts. So you can look back at it as a global phenomenon, and all this stuff supports the data we've gotten that capitalism, by its very nature, its very structure, is a highly exploitative system. And this is the outcome of it.
That's right. That's right.
Exploitative economics. It also has a boom and bust cycle.
Yes.
So you run in, make as much money as you can, and then capital flight.
That's the whole concept of destroying communities. That's the old idea of a boom town and a ghost town, which everybody knows about, watch Western movies. If you really look at that history, that's really what it comes out to. Capitalism is a system that will go in, and it's kind of like getting a cocaine fix. You infuse so much capital and exploit so much labor to extract surplus value in the millions or billions of dollars, and then you take that and you walk away with it and leave everybody else. It's kind of like when the tide recedes and you walk away with all the the wealth. So you literally destroy societies and communities.
Absolutely.
That's the idea. They start falling apart. And so we have all the data, all the characteristics of major institutional crisis. The Gilens-Page analysis of oligarchy, the famous work by Professor Sheldon Wolin in Democracy, Inc., which Chris Hedges did a fabulous interview about, where he talks about
on RT, he has an RT television show, right?
Right, on Contact too. And then of course the recent one, Professor Chomsky did a fabulous interview on the Requiem for the American Dream.
Yeah.
What essentially he did was he just summed up the historical endpoint where we're at. You know, everything essentially is falling apart.
It's totally falling apart. I want to make sure we get a little time here to talk about Lucy, and then get into also the hard work that goes into worker cooperatives, which we talked about. What does Lucy do? Tell us a little bit about that organization. It stands for
Los Angeles Union Cooperative Initiative. So we operate on a variety of levels. Our fundamental and long-term purpose is to actually incubate, convert, do startups, incubate businesses that are worker cooperatives. But we also mediate that zone between the worker cooperative community and labor unions as they are today. And because the worker cooperative community, you're talking about entrepreneurs, they're usually not people who have been in unions, and so they don't see the natural relationship between unions and worker cooperatives. And then on the union side, we're just really busy fighting back, the attacks on unions, and trying to operate at a scale which is vastly different than worker cooperatives. And so the union community is not really, seeing the worker cooperative community as an alternative for them, because the scale is so much different. So we're trying to mediate that line to get people talking to each other. That's what we do in the Union Co-op Council of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives on a national scale. But Lucy is that group of union activists and that are attempting to do that in the Los Angeles area. So we speak and we try to educate the community, but we also look for opportunities to create worker cooperative businesses. And in Los Angeles, there's been estimated that about 10,000 small businesses will change hands due to the baby boomers retiring.
Wow.
This is, nationwide, there's I think it's $3 to $5 trillion worth of businesses.
Wow.
Some enormous number. Don't quote me on that number because I'm just pulling that out of my memory banks.
That's a lot.
It's a lot of businesses that will change hands due to baby boomers retiring. Now, what do we want? Do we want them to close that business and 20 people each lose their job? No, what we want to do is we want to see them continue through that crisis of leadership. And so we're proposing the alternative of turning them into worker cooperatives. The people that have worked there know how to do their work. They know how to do the job. And they've been working together for a while. So, of course, if they're unionized, they have a tremendous sense of solidarity, which is equivalent to cooperative education. Right. But if they're not, that can be developed. And so, we'd like to step into that void there and help convert those businesses to locally owned worker cooperatives, because then they're going to stay in Los Angeles. They're not going to be closed by their corporate owners and their assets.
They're not going to create ghost towns.
Ghost towns, yes, right, exactly.
Right. Even in Southern California.
Even out of Los Angeles.
Exactly.
Right, and so it's in our interest as community members to make sure that happens. And so we're trying to take the lead on that principle.
And going forward, I definitely want to talk to you more and more about the work that you do and your partners, and we'll actually get some case studies, maybe get some case studies in here, or go in the field and do stories on them. I think that would be a great ongoing
and some personal collaboration.
Right. A personal collaboration as well as an educational one for people tuning in and watching and listening, and because we are going to turn these into blogs too.
One more point to what she's saying are the educational institutions involved. We're going to start through community colleges and universities and colleges, creating this bridge and institutionalizing that education to bring unions and co-ops together.
Well, we are building those bridges now. There's a labor studies program at the LA Trade Tech. Southwest College has hosted some workshops in collective remake.
Yes, and which I think would be
building
another
those
great
bridges
guest
now,
for our show.
because 95% of all business incubators are at educational institutions.
Wow.
Yeah.
So wow, I did not know that. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's most business incubators are attached to educational institutions, universities and whatnot.
That's fantastic. That's good to know.
Yeah.
That's really good to know. That's we'll have to look into going into that subject matter a lot more going forward.
Well, in our business schools, we have to, reach out to people who are faculty at business schools because they're only teaching one business model.
That's
Exactly.
right. That's
We
exactly.
have to let them know that there is this alternative business model.
And
That
we,
is
we
better
need, yes,
for
we
our
need a new
communities.
education for a new type of manager, cooperative manager.
That's
We need to educate
absolutely
Capitalist
right.
executive.
Yeah.
We need to
And-
get those entrepreneurs where they're first starting out.
Right.
And I know we've already kind of gone into this a little bit, but let's watch our third video now with Professor Richard Wolff. And I would call this video Crisis Leading to the Failure of Capitalism. This is Professor Richard Wolff again.
Here we are in the second biggest crisis. We're not establishing Social Security, we're cutting it. We're not extending unemployment benefits, we just finished cutting them off. And we don't even discuss a public employment program. Wow. It's all been undone. So here was the mistake. You cannot solve the contradictions, the catastrophes, the crises of capitalism. You cannot undo the abandonment of North America, Western Europe, and Japan in the way I described, unless you deal with the organization of the enterprise. Who makes the decisions for what purposes about the daily functioning of an enterprise? If you don't deal with that, then the people who are in charge, the major shareholders and the boards of directors, will move out of the country, will undo the federal rules and regulations, and keep producing crises the way capitalism always has. Capitalism has been dominant for 250 years. It has never solved economic crisis. Roosevelt made speech after speech at which he said, my policies will not only get us out of the Great Depression, but they will make sure that no future downturn like this will afflict our children. That was a promise he made, but he could not keep. Every president since Roosevelt, including Obama, has promised the same. My policies will get us out of the downturn and will make sure this never happens again. None of them has ever delivered on this promise. They can't, because to deliver on that promise, even though they don't understand it, means to undo the system that presents us with the problem. If you lived in an apartment with a roommate as unstable as capitalism has been, you would have moved out long ago, or demanded that your roommate get professional help. Why do we accept to live in a system that works this way?
So Richard Wolff, that's a long-running joke that he has about if you had a roommate that was as dysfunctional as capitalism, you would have moved out long ago. It's so true, though. I mean, there's a lot of yeah. or he says suggested that he get professional help. I like that. That's great. And by the way, Professor Richard Wolff will be back on this show at some point in the future, and I'll be sure to let you know about that for sure. We're going to start wrapping this up now. One of the examples, one of the case studies, one of the partners that you work with is the Vermont Gauge Car Wash Company. Mm-hmm. That's here in LA. Tell us a little bit about that and how that's a challenge. That's a good example of how worker cooperatives is hard work.
Yeah,
also.
It is indeed. Well, I think that it illustrates a number of things. So the story of the Vermont Gauge Car Wash is you have to start back a few years, which is this is a group of men that have worked together for a number of years, over a decade, I believe now, and they were working together when the Clean Car Wash campaign, funded by the AFL-CIO and the Steelworkers and various other partners, started organizing car washes, because they're some of the lowest paid workers in our economy. They're the most exploited workers in our economy, and this will illustrate that. This was the very first group of workers who stood up against their boss and organized and became the very first union organized car wash in the world. Okay.
Wow.
So now they were being paid $4 an hour and half their tips.
Wow.
So I want to repeat
Half.
that because it's usually unimaginable to most Americans that people have to work for $4 an hour. They have a regular job they go to every day, and they work for $4 an hour and half their tips. And if it rains, they say just don't come into work today. So they're not even being paid a lot of time. Okay. They had no sick days, they had no vacation days, they had no health care, they have none, and they had no process to deal with an exploitative boss. So they union organized, and that takes a lot of strength right there. In that process of union organizing, you're going up against the boss. You learn to trust each other, you learn to work together, you learn to make democratic decisions. Elect officers to your union. So they went through a process where they, again, after they organized, which put them working together and building a sense of solidarity culture, then they were for about 6 or 8 years a union unit, bargaining unit with the steelworkers, which means they elect officers and send delegates and pay their dues and do all the things that unions do. And that's also working together. And when they have issues, even among themselves, they learn a process for dealing with it within their unit, okay, within their democratic process, because all unions are at their basis democratic. Okay, after organizing and then working together as a unit for 6 or 8 years, what happened is that the owner of this business, who was not the landlord, but just owned the business, who had been paying them $4 an hour and half their tips, came in one day, cleaned out the till, and bolted everything up, locked everything up, and left. Disappeared.
Wow.
Now, that person left owning the landlord's month's rent, several months' rent, I don't remember exactly how many months' rent, owing all their vendors, and wage theft. Owing hadn't paid the wages to the workers for weeks before that. So wage theft. Now this is grand theft. This is criminal. So because they were a unit of the steelworkers and they had been that group that had gone up against their boss, one of the very first car wash, the steelworkers helped them out. They helped organizing them. So the first thing they did was they created a benefit car wash. I mean, they've just had their wages stolen. So church parking lots, washing cars to raise some money to help them pay their rent and get some food, But then they helped them secure the site, the work site. They had to work with the landlord to represent them because these workers are not used to taking that role. And of course the landlord's not trusting just 15 guys, that had been workers. So they helped mediate that and negotiate the lease on the building. And then they did trainings of the workers how to keep books, how to do that kind of work. So the steelworkers were definitely instrumental, and stayed with them, to help them out, keep monitoring them, help them get the training that they need, and day by day. Then it became a worker cooperative over time, and it took a year and a half to 2 years to get through all of these. They are now the only car wash in the entire city who has all of the permits and all of the bonds and all of the business licenses, because there are a number of business licenses and bonds and permits that one needs, but most of the car washes are operating without them.
Wow.
So here you have the most legitimate business, car wash in the city being run by 15 guys. Yeah. So instead of 15 people out of a job, you have 15 new owners of a business.